Imagine stepping into the private dining room of a Roman senator. Marble floors cool beneath your feet. Incense clouds the air with scents of frankincense and myrrh. Golden goblets shimmer in the candlelight. And on the table, not lasagna, not spaghetti, but roasted flamingo tongues, dormice stuffed with herbs, and peacocks reassembled with their dazzling feathers intact. This isn't dinner. This is performance. A declaration of wealth, power, and reach. Because in ancient Rome, the rich didn't just eat to live. They ate to conquer. So let's pull back the velvet curtain and step inside the feasting halls of Rome's elite, where the food was outrageous, the politics were brutal, and every dish told the story of a civilization that believed indulgence was proof of dominance. Feasting as power. Let's get one thing straight. Rich Romans didn't throw dinner parties. They staged spectacles. To dine with the elite was to witness a theater of wealth. The couches were arranged in a U-shape around a central table. Guests reclined like emperors, while slaves offered scented water for washing hands between courses. Music played, dancers performed, poets recited verses between bites. This wasn't just about food, it was about status. Banquets could last for hours, some for days. To be invited was an honor. To host was a statement. And if your table lacked exotic dishes, imported spices, and jaw-dropping culinary tricks, you weren't just a bad host, you were irrelevant. Gustatio, the appetizer that showed off your empire. The first course of a Roman feast was known as gustatio, but don't think of it as just an appetizer. This was the opening act, a culinary drum roll that announced to all, you haven't seen anything yet. For the rich, it wasn't about getting filled up. It was about setting the stage for the extravagance to come and flaunting wealth in every bite. So, what kicked off this sensory spectacle? Oysters were a classic favorite. Fresh, briny, and so abundant in the empire that they were shipped in barrels from as far as Britain and the coasts of North Africa. When you served oysters at your banquet, you weren't just offering a food item. You were showcasing Rome's vast reach and control over the seas. Then there were the stuffed dormice, a dish that might sound strange today, but was a delicacy of the highest order. These little creatures were filled with minced pork, pepper, pine nuts, and drizzled with honey before being roasted to perfection. The combination of sweet and savory, exotic yet familiar, made them a symbol of Roman sophistication. Boiled eggs also made an appearance, sprinkled with black pepper and garum. Fermented fish sauce that clung to every elite Roman dish like perfume, adding a pungent, umami kick that could be smelled from across the room. And let's not forget the olives. Some wrinkled and cured, others plump and green, plucked from the groves of Hispania or the hills of Greece. They were more than just a snack. They were a testament to the empire's far-reaching trade networks. Each item on the gustatio wasn't just food, it was a display of distance, cost, and influence. Serving these delicacies told your guests that you had access to the farthest corners of the known world, and that alone made you someone worth knowing. The main course. Opulence on a platter. Then came the prima mensa, the main event. This was where things became extravagant, and sometimes downright absurd. Elite Romans treated the dining table like a stage, and the main course was their grand finale. Peacock, roasted whole and then dressed again in its brilliant blue-green plumage. It looked as if it might take flight right off the table. Flamingo tongues, sliced thin and praised for their delicate texture. Wild boar, stuffed with live birds. When carved, the birds would explode from the carcass, fluttering into the air. Pure spectacle. Giraffe, for the senator who wanted to prove he had connections from North Africa to the Nile. Sea urchins, opened tableside to reveal briny gold inside. Eel cooked in saffron, a luxurious spice that turned even humble seafood into imperial delicacy. Pork was the true star, though. Rich Romans adored pigs. They were roasted whole, flavored with honey, stuffed with sausages, or boiled with figs and leeks. But the most absurd dish of all? One feast reportedly included meatballs made of ostrich brain, not for taste, but for shock value. Because in Rome, your menu was your megaphone. Spices. Taste the world. Spices were where things got ridiculous. The Roman elite didn't just eat spices, they invested in them. They flaunted them. They hoarded them like treasure. Why? because spices came from far away. The farther the origin, the higher the status. Pepper from India, which could cost its weight in silver. Cinnamon from Sri Lanka, often reserved for the emperor's table. Saffron from Spain, delicate, golden, and worth more than gold itself. Myrrh and frankincense from Arabia, used in both cuisine and ritual. Even basic seasoning was political. A simple peppered dish wasn't simple. It was proof that the empire's veins pulsed trade routes thousands of miles long. In fact, when the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 AD, they demanded 3,000 pounds of black pepper as part of the ransom. Think about that. Bread for the elite. Bread was a staple for everyone in Rome. For the common citizen, it was the foundation of their diet, a basic filling food to keep them going through the day. But for the elite, bread was transformed into a symbol of luxury and status, a refined art form that showcased their wealth. While the poor chewed through coarse loaves made with a mix of grains and ash, the rich enjoyed bread that could only be described as exquisite. The flour was so fine it looked like freshly fallen snow, sifted multiple times to remove impurities and create a texture so light it practically melted in the mouth. It was baked in specially designed ovens, where the temperature was carefully regulated to ensure the perfect crust and crumb. But luxury bread didn't stop at texture. It was infused with flavors that hinted at the wealth and influence of its eater. Some loaves were flavored with delicate herbs like rosemary and thyme, while others were sweetened with honey or even infused with cheese, making every bite a sensory experience. One of the most coveted types of bread was the panis quadratus, a type of loaf baked in perfect symmetrical segments, making it a visual work of art as much as a food item. Archaeologists have even found loaves of panis quadratus preserved in the ashes of Pompeii, a testament to how luxury baking was already established centuries before the city's destruction. The uniform segments were more than just a baking technique. They were a status symbol that signified the power and taste of the household that could afford such elegance. But here's the kicker. The elite Romans didn't bake their own bread. No, they bought entire bakeries, or more commonly, they owned the enslaved bakers who did the work for them. These bakeries were businesses, often employing dozens of workers, and some of the finest bakers even achieved a certain level of fame. The rich could be found flaunting their access to these artisanal creations, often ordering loaves directly from the most renowned bakeries in the empire. Bread wasn't just food. It was an essential piece of the Roman elite's image. Cheese, stinky, sharp, and status-soaked. Rome's elite were obsessed with cheese, but not the kind you'd find neatly wrapped in your local market. They wanted bold, pungent wheels aged to perfection, dripping with character and reeking of power. Forget the soft, bland varieties. The upper class craved complexity. Their cheeses were made from sheep or goat's milk, aged in caves where the temperature and moisture were carefully controlled. Some were smoked over fragrant woods. Others were packed in aromatic herbs, rosemary, thyme, even wild fennel, and stored in clay pots to ferment for months, sometimes years. The goal wasn't just flavor, it was transformation. These cheeses didn't just taste strong, they announced themselves from across the room. In fact, some were so pungent that even guests with the most refined palates recoiled at first sniff before diving in for more. Because in Roman society, if your food didn't smell offensively expensive, it wasn't worth eating. Soft cheeses had their place too. Ricotta-like curds were whipped into garlicky spreads, sometimes seasoned with vinegar or layered with sweet honey and crushed nuts. These were often served between courses to reset the palate, a creamy interlude between meat and wine. For the Romans, cheese was more than sustenance. It was a textural playground, a symbol of refined taste, and a flex of culinary sophistication. The more unusual the preparation, and the more challenging the smell, the more impressive the host. If your banquet didn't stink just a little, it wasn't elite enough. Wine, but only if you mix it. In Rome, wine flowed like water. But here's the catch. Only the poor drank it straight. For the elite, unmixed wine was crude, vulgar, practically a crime against taste. The aristocracy treated wine like a blank canvas. They diluted it with water, often cooled with snow hauled down from the mountains. They infused it with herbs like thyme, fennel, or myrrh. Some poured in honey for sweetness. Others added seawater for a briny kick. It wasn't about numbing the senses, it was about refining them. Every sip was curated, elevated, made to say, "I have taste, I have power." To drink undiluted wine? That was something uncultured barbarians did. And yet, paradoxically, getting absolutely hammered was part of the elite banquet experience. Overindulgence wasn't a slip-up. It was a spectacle. Emperor Elagabalus took this to absurd levels, throwing feasts where only colored wines were served. Red for summer, green for spring, black for winter. Entire drinking sessions were themed. Sometimes guests were given different wines for each course, like a modern sommelier's pairing menu on steroids. And the cellars? Not just storage, status vaults. Wine was kept in tall clay amphorae, sealed with resin, marked with vintage and origin. Falernian from Campania was the gold standard, rich, potent, and ruinously expensive. Senators boasted of wines aged decades longer than their guests had lived. For the Roman elite, wine wasn't just a drink, it was a statement. And if you didn't know how to sip it right, you didn't belong at the table. Dessert, rich enough to worship. Dessert in ancient Rome wasn't just an afterthought. It was the grand finale. A final, decadent act meant to impress, indulge, and even sanctify. If the main course was a spectacle, dessert was the curtain call, designed to linger on the palate and in the memory. The elite didn't settle for sweetness alone. Their desserts were crafted to reflect status, wealth, and even piety. A favorite among the upper crust? Figures, but not just plucked off a tree. These were figs split open, stuffed with toasted almonds or walnuts, and soaked in imported honey so thick it shimmered like gold. Cheesecakes were common too, made with fresh ricotta, mixed with eggs and flour, then wrapped in flaky pastry or baked on bay leaves for added aroma. These weren't light, airy cakes. They were rich, earthy, and satisfying, meant to sit heavy in the belly like a luxury tax. Fruit was another centerpiece. But this wasn't local orchard fare. These were delicacies imported from the farthest corners of the empire. Juicy dates from Judea, tart pomegranates from Carthage, plump cherries from the Black Sea region. Every bite reminded guests of how far Roman power extended. And then there was the libum, a small round cheesecake made with wheat flour and cheese, sweetened with honey, and often burned as an offering to the gods before being served to mortals. These desserts weren't just eaten. They were part of a ritual, a performance, half prayer, half indulgence. Even in sweetness, Rome flexed its empire. The invisible kitchen. But none of this indulgence happened on its own. Behind every steaming roast and golden goblet was an army of invisible hands. Slaves, servants, cooks, cupbearers, tasters. Each one played a precise role. The Roman elite never lifted a finger. Why would they, when their kitchens ran like miniature empires? Cooks weren't just laborers. They were craftsmen. Some specialized in meats, others in sauces, others in baking. A particularly talented chef could gain notoriety among the upper class, and some were even traded between households like prized possessions. Greek chefs were especially prized for their perceived sophistication, while Egyptian spice handlers and Syrian confectioners brought exotic techniques and flavors that Roman guests expected. Elite Roman kitchens functioned like complex machines. There were head cooks, archimagiri, who commanded entire teams, issuing orders and coordinating multiple courses across hours of service. Beneath them were subordinates for butchering, boiling, roasting, grinding, and baking. Others focused solely on presentation, arranging food into elaborate displays with feathers, flowers, or sculpted dough. Security was also critical. Wealthy Romans feared poisoning so intensely that many dishes were first tested by a designated pregustator, a slave whose sole job was to sample each course before the master dared take a bite. Still others kept the fire stoked, the dishes clean, the wine flowing, the tables reset. Some kitchens were so large and well-staffed they resembled miniature barracks, smoky, chaotic, and humming with shouted commands. Yet despite their skill and essential role, most of these laborers lived short, brutal lives. They sweated in the heat, inhaled smoke daily, and rarely saw the lavish feasts they helped produce. So while Roman banquets dazzled the eyes and stunned the senses, it's worth remembering, Every bite of peacock or flamingo tongue was built on the backs of people history rarely names. Conclusion: when the banquets ended, and then Rome fell. The trade routes broke, the chefs scattered, the spices stopped flowing. Suddenly, there were no more peacocks with feathers, no more wine aged 30 years in amphorae. Europe entered a dark age, not just of politics and culture, but of cuisine. For centuries, no one on the continent ate as well as the Romans once did. So the next time you sip wine, drizzle honey, or savor imported spices, remember, the Romans did it first, and they did it extravagantly. If this journey into the stomach of Roman luxury blew your mind, hit that like button. For more shocking, strange, and forgotten facts from the ancient world, hit subscribe and join the channel. And here's your question for the comments. If you were invited to a Roman elite banquet, would you try the flamingo tongue or stick with the bread and cheese? Because in ancient Rome, dinner wasn't just a meal. It was a declaration of empire, served hot.